Hello, everyone. My name is Ryan Bailey. I'm from Elsevier. And again, I want to thank Dan and Bei Peng from the Graduate Student Council for helping put this together. Today, we're going to take a 2-hour session to look at academic publishing. So we've assembled this panel to kind of take you through this process. And the way this is going to work is that we're going to start with a presentation that's already up there, which really looks at the preparation, the research, and the writing process itself. So that presentation is going to take about 40 to 45 minutes. During this presentation, our panel members are going to interject with certain specificities to their specific disciplines and backgrounds, but we ask that you hold questions until the end of that first session. When that first session's over, we're going to have about 15 or so minutes for questions. Then we're going to pass it over to the second piece, which is really going to look at the editorial process, so what you don't see. After you submit your paper or send it out, what's going on behind the scenes? What could you have done to, in that process to help you prepare better up front? We expect that presentation to take about 25, maybe 30 minutes, and then we'll have the remainder of the 2-hour session for a Q&A open for everyone. Then following this, COSI will be bringing some catering, and we'll have the speakers and a couple of my colleagues as well out, and we'll have opportunity to continue conversations over a sandwich and a drink and some other things. So at this point, what I'd like to do is have each of the speakers introduce themselves. And first, I want to say that Carrie Christensen, she'll be doing the first part, and Elena Porro will be doing the second part. So I'm going to let these guys introduce themselves, and then Carrie's going to kick us off.
Sure. Yeah, I'm Elena Porro. I'm an editor at Cell. Thank you, Albert. I'm Elena Porro. I'm an editor at Cell, which is part of Cell Press just down the street. And I'm going to be talking to you today about the editorial process and what happens after submission.
Oh, okay. I'm Albert Meyer. I'm a professor of electrical engineering and computer science, and I've been that since before all of you in the audience were born, I think. I've also been the editor-in-chief of a journal called Information and Computation since 1982. The field is theoretical computer science, mathematical theoretical computer science, complexity theory, distributed computation theory, very mathematical journal. We have a standard form letter that says you have verified the importance of your work experimentally, send it to somebody else. I think that most of what I say will, I think, not be relevant to this audience. My understanding of this audience is that you're mostly in the hard sciences, biology and chemistry. Anybody not in a hard science here? Okay, give me a hint on what your areas are. Architecture, okay. People back there, yeah?
Energy storage.
What storage?
Energy storage.
Energy storage, okay. So you wouldn't style yourself a physicist or?
I'm an engineer.
Oh, you're an engineer of energy, okay. I'll stand then by my comment that the activities of my journal and what we do, you will learn by contrast to what matters to you. We operate very differently, and it won't hurt you to know about that. Okay.
Hello, I'm Professor Richard Braatz. My main appointment is in chemical engineering, but I publish in chemistry, biology, physics, electrical engineering, chemical engineering, bioengineering, and a few other areas. So I have a lot of experience in a wide variety of journals. I'm the editor-in-chief of IEEE Control Systems, and I'm editor-in-large of optimal control applications and methods, and I've served on lots of editorial boards in sciences, but mostly engineering, some in the sciences.
That brings it to me, I suppose. Good evening. My name is Carrie Christensen, and I'm an Elsevier publisher. My portfolio focuses on the aerospace and computational engineering fields, and I've had the pleasure of working with some of your colleagues for the last 7.5 years. However, I've been in the publishing world for about 17 years. So I was actually just up here last month. One of my editors-in-chief, Jürgen Bata, runs the Computers and Structures Journal, and he holds a conference annually just down the street on the river. And it's great to be back here again so soon to speak with you. It's going to be an interesting 40 minutes. I usually have about 6 hours to say what I'm going to say, so I've had extra coffee, and let's just dive in. Amongst my history, this is the first week of these, so if I fall over, an engineer, come and prop me up, please. So we're going to just dive right in. Before I get into the writing a manuscript, which is why you're all here, or the free food, I'm here for the food, and to meet all of you, of course, is the number one question: what does a publisher actually do? Don't tell me. Just think about it and keep it in the back of your mind while we have our quality time here together. I will say many people think of a publisher as a printer. And we do, obviously, print or e-print scholarly articles and communications and conference proceedings and pamphlets and literature and all the like and good old-fashioned journals. But we do actually do more than just kill rainforests, and actually we don't do that. We're pretty green. But the official party line is that, I have to actually read this because I don't think I actually do any of this. Publishers coordinate the exchange of ideas between authors, editors, reviewers, and the wider STM audience of researchers, scientists, health professionals, students, and patients. We are continually investing in technology to find new methods or develop current practices to carry out these 5 roles. That is what Elsevier does at large. That is all true. But what do we do? Well, it boils down to we try to be a problem solver. We try to be a partner for you, your colleagues, to develop, maintain, and support the sciences that you work in. And your job is to study and research and find the cure to cancer, figure out how to colonize Mars, and figure out how to replicate the crystalline structure of what spiders do. I was at a conference last week. It's absolutely amazing. And I'm picking some of this up. So it's your job to save the world and figure out the leading challenges that present themselves to society. Our job is to be an underlying partner, is to build a better platform for you to showcase your work, for you to communicate with your colleagues either in the lab next door or around the world. It is our job to support you in either providing research, disseminating your own works, gathering you collectively at a conference, transmitting that conference via the internet or a WebEx for those who can't make it, to organizing editorial boards, to just about anything that you may need help with. That is what a publisher does. And that's a great overview, very, very broad stroke. But it is our pleasure, I would say, to collaborate with you as a real true support partner. So, enough about us. On to you. Why you're really here. How to write a great paper. Now, you all made it in MIT, so you're obviously the smartest people in the Northern Hemisphere, if not the world. So why do you need to listen to me about how to write a paper? What do I know? Well, I've seen a bit. I would say the number one golden rule is an old adage: measure twice, cut once. There are a lot of things you need to do before you even write a paper. And I don't think it's thought about when you're doing your research, nor should it be thought about when you're doing your research. But a bit of what Albert said before is you may learn by contrast tonight. I won't harp too much about how I'm spoiled with usually doing this in a much greater time space. So I've thought the fastest way to illustrate was to perhaps focus on what not to do. And I would actually turn this question to our panel, because I can speak to it anecdotally, but why listen to me when you can actually hear from real live editors in terms of sort of pet peeves or pain points in terms of, what are maybe the biggest time wasters or the things that really sort of turn them off when it comes to receiving different kinds of papers. And it does, this does vary through discipline to discipline. So I don't know if you want to jump in or.
Sure. I mean, I think the
Pop quiz.
the biggest point for me when you're submitting a paper, writing a paper, is that you want to make sure the person on the other side can understand what you've done and the significance of what you've done with the least amount of work on their side. So you want to make it easy for them to understand your work and the significance of it. So I think that's the point of all the more detailed information that Carrie's going to give you on how to put a paper together.
Hopefully. Gentlemen, or wait? Or, no? Not yet. Okay. I have a feeling that I'm going to hear from him quite a bit at the end of this half hour, which is why we are here. So, best type of manuscript. How do you, what should you be doing? And that does vary from discipline to discipline. So I'm just going to quickly describe the three most commonly found types of publications within our journals, which would be the research article, a short communication, or a review article. And a research article is probably what you're most commonly familiar with. It is, you've probably been reading them for years. They're about between 8 and 10 pages. They have about between 5 and 8 figures. That's discipline dependent. 20 to 25 references, and it's a good foundation building block of an engineer's research career. I think that translates, but I'm not going to speak too boldly on that. Then we have short communications, which are much, well, as the name implies, much shorter in length, between 2 and 4 pages. Some journals have a rapid review procedure for these papers. They are meant to be timely. They are meant to, sort of be the newsletters or the I'm going to date myself, the Western Union telegrams of the science. And some journals even have a sort of a spin-off journal that would just be a rapid communications branch of their main journal if there is enough of this type of activity in the field. And then the third, which is a much more in-depth work, would be a review article. And I actually have Progress in Aerospace Sciences is an invited reviews only journal. We just topped out this year with impact factor of 3, which in engineering is pretty awesome, and it's very well respected, very well received, and internally I refer to it as the one with the velvet rope. Those papers tend to run between 40 and 80 pages in length. They are, for my journal, it's definitely a historical overview, and they, not all review journals are invited only, but the majority of them are invited or commissioned by the editors. It's not the author submit scenario, as is with most research articles. It's definitely an excellent way to really put your mark on the science, and to, I'd say most review authors are established in their scientific career. So that is the kind of articles that you would be writing, and again, depends on your science and it depends on your goal. And then after you figure out what kind of article you're going to write, next big question: where do I want to publish? Where do I belong? What's the best use of my brains on paper and my research? And as important as this is, especially when you're starting out, is how do I know? And I'm going to push the analogy here, but I always think of my mom. Ask Mr. Webster. Every time I asked her, this is 10,000 years ago when I was a child before the internet, whenever I asked her how to spell a word, she said, ask Mr. Webster, and go look it up. Every journal, at least every Elsevier journal, and we have 2,000, has a journal homepage. On this homepage is, yes, okay, can't see that. The guide for authors, the aims and scopes of the journal, the editorial boards, the editors-in-chief, the top cited articles, the top currently downloaded articles, the impact factor, and usually links to special issues and conferences that are relevant to the journal. Any of you who know Professor Bata, be sure I had his journal up here, so his publisher didn't forget about him, even though he's, I think, on vacation. Every answer, for the most part, this is a good place to start. Of course, go to your advisor, go to your colleagues, go to your roommate. These are all viable sources, but you really can sort of curtail of these 12, where do I go, and get it down to maybe 3 or 4 to figure out where the action is. So, Albert, this is very different in computer science.
Well, I was just thinking that an issue that is an issue for us, not really for the community, is that we do get a large number of papers, mostly from Asia, from people who have obviously never looked at the journal page. They're completely out of scope. They're completely the wrong kind of paper. We've never published anything like it. And how they get our name and send it to me, I don't know. We had at one point a hypothetical nasty letter based on the assumption that they were double publishing. That it made sense that they were broadcasting their paper to a lot of different journals, because how could they hit us when we're so out of scope? That was sort of, say, reminding them about the ethics that you're not supposed to double publish. And then I decided, to hell with it, let's just trash these papers, and that's pretty much what we do. We write a letter that just, I just tell my staff, reject out of scope, and they generate a standard letter. Yeah. But I would say half our submissions are that now.
I guess one of the first things you ask is, when you're thinking about where you should publish, is what journals have you cited in the paper that you wrote? So if you've written a paper that has a lot of citations to journals in Polymer, then probably you should be submitting to the journal Polymer. So that's one of the clear indications. It's not always a perfect way of doing it, though, because sometimes you might want to hit an audience that is not necessarily served typically by the papers in that journal. So let me give you an example. So we published a couple of papers that were heavy computational theory papers we published in an experimental journal. Okay. Normally you wouldn't do that. But the reason we did that was because we had done these simulations to provide a lot of guidance. Well, first, explanation for experimental observations in literature, and a lot of guidance on how people should design systems. And those actually sailed through the review process, even though they were theoretical. And normally that wouldn't happen in experimental journal. Usually experimental journal, you submit to experimental journal, if your theory, forget it, it's going to get rejected right away. But this was an exception because it was clearly met the needs of the readers, which really leads to the second thing, which is really related, which is just that I always feel that it's when you think about the impact, you can try to go through the various impact factors and statistics, but what really matters, I would argue, is how much have you really influenced the community. So when I look at the particular journal, I'm saying, is this the readership that I want to hit? Is that really, that's really what matters. So,
So I'm just thinking again about my own experience with that. It's great advice. I mean, the first place to consider publishing is where there's a dominant journal among your citations. In my theoretical area, people also will sometimes try to go to my journal when they've never published in my journal, and none of the papers they submit are from that they cite are from my journal for certification reasons. They've been to they cite many papers in some other theoretical journal, maybe one of their own or two of their own, but they want to have another journal and another community of editors certify the quality of their work. It strengthens their own resume if they can point to their work being acceptable to several prestigious theoretical journals. So we see that those are not a problem for us. They're fine. We occasionally see authors from other areas, say artificial intelligence, control theory, and some other area that I wrote down, I've forgotten now, who aspire to, they think they've made an important theoretical contribution. They want to call their work to our attention because they think it may be relevant. And that sometimes works, although often is not. It turns out that, again, what they think is an important theoretical contribution doesn't fit with the expectations of the community that we think we represent and our audience.
I could mention one other thing that's going to show up. So when you're looking at where to publish, there are certain fields. Bio is a good example where it's very common where certain groups will just submit everything to, let's say, science, and then have it rejected, and then go to nature, and then have it rejected, and then just keep going down a list until they get to maybe the 5th or 6th journal, and then get it accepted. So there are certain fields where those kind of practices, I'd say, can be reasonably common. But generally in my group and many of the areas I worked in, we generally don't do that so much because it just wastes so much time that we'll usually try to hit. I try to hit it so that the paper I have should be in the top maybe 20%, let's say, for that journal. So sort of very good chance, going to be accepted, you know, at least 8, unless you get some weird fluke with a reviewer, just because I just don't have the time to go through all those lists. I have done it before, but it's not something I normally do. But some fields, they do it all the time that way, and it's sort of accepted practice, so.
Yeah, and I think that was actually addresses one of the questions. We got some questions from you guys in advance about aiming high, essentially, and do you want to aim higher than you think your paper might be a strong candidate for? And I would agree with Richard that that's something you want to think carefully about because it can waste a lot of your time, it can waste some time of the reviewers, and I think it can be aggravating and discouraging to you on the other end when you get a lot of criticism. And so I think really a good thing to think about is aiming realistically to a journal. You know, don't aim too low, but really think about where, how Richard explained, where your paper is going to be a good fit, and it'll be a much more positive and encouraging experience for you.
Excellent. All very good points, and they're echoing things I hear from my editors, you know, the hand-wringing and the hair-pulling of why don't they read the guide for authors, and how did they think we were appropriate, and all the things that have been said here. And another thing is, yes, aiming high, of course, is great. We all want to maybe publish in Nature, maybe not, but that's not necessarily the best use of your paper also. And if you're thinking about, and I was told to Ryan that some degree this is, you know, career development as well, and not just how to write a paper. And to that extent, landing your paper in the top journal that has the highest impact factor, yes, of course, this should be congratulated and everyone will be very proud and happy, but it doesn't necessarily mean you're ever going to get cited. It doesn't mean you're ever going to get read. It doesn't mean you're going to move forward with that paper ever again. So I think what's been said by the panel here is there are many reasons to very carefully consider your target, if you will, and not just based on it's the top-ranked journal or the professor, or the editor-in-chief is my advisor, things like that. So very, very good points.
Let me just say that it's your problem, not ours. I mean, as an editor, when we get papers that are obviously weak, it really doesn't take a lot of time. We can summarily reject them. When they're not weak and they go through, but they have some credibility and they have to go through a lengthy refereeing process, what that means is that, in fact, they had a shot and it's legitimate. So it's your risk, really, not mine. I don't mind your stretching to send a weak paper into our journal, but you're putting yourself at risk of wasting a lot of time, especially, again, in my narrow area where the typical serious research papers can take years to solve the problem and write up, and they will take years to referee. So you don't want to submit to us unless you think you have a good shot.
So, and thank you for that segue, because under not really our or the editor or the reviewer's problem is language. And I think regardless of the discipline, everyone here is going to agree that you need to be clear, you need to be concise, you need to be comprehensible. I'm sure there's a few other adages, more is less. And at the end of the day, it is your responsibility. The onus is on you to do everything within your power to ethically and legally and properly present your best work. And that's not just brilliant research, of course that's part of it, but you have to be able to tell a story. And having said that, Elsevier, and I know other publishing houses, which I'm probably not supposed to talk about, but we're all in this together. While it is your responsibility, there are many, many services that Elsevier and I'm sure the other large publishing houses offer, and possibly even to some extent, right here on campus, and not just your roommate. Although, hey, if they're an English major, they won't know what you're talking about, but they can tell you if you've put together a good sentence or not. So, under a little more detail of that vein, I would say let these 4 words guide you. Print them out, put them on your desk, put them on your PC. This is the way to be sure that your story is understood by your audience, or more importantly, even before the audience of the editor and the potential referees. So you need to be accurate, you need to be concise, you need to be clear, and you need to be objective. And I would also say that these 3 rules to go with those 4 words would be a good guide as well. You need to get to, you want to make your point, you want to be clear, and really, you're walking someone through your research. And while to some extent you're speaking to a knowledgeable audience, you're there because what you've done is special and different. And everyone in the room is special and different. Do not give your grandmother my email to tell me how special you are. You're all very special. Your paper is not necessarily special. It is your job to let the audience know. And at this point, when I'm speaking of audience, I'm speaking of the editor and the referee as to why you are special. And getting your message, getting an elevator pitch, as we call it in the business, you have 2 minutes to sell yourself. Now here's an example, let's see if I can do this, of what not to do. So you've all read enough, you're far enough along in your academic careers. At what point do I lose you? If it is the case, intravenous administration should result in that the emulsion has higher intravenous administration retention concentration, but which is not in accordance with the result, and therefore the more rational interpretation should be that SLN with it. Do we even care anymore? Is anyone even listening to me? I can't breathe, so we're not going to do any more. So this is an example of what not to do. Now here is a more concise way. It's still, it's not taking 10 sentences and shoving it into one. You're not there to explain verbally to the person reading your paper. So your paper has to speak for you. And the clearer you can be and the more direct you can be, the longer you'll hold your audience and the better chance you have to sell. And so these are 2 more rules. I guess I've given you 7 rules in 3 slides, so I guess I'll give you these slides so you can print them out and tape them to your PC. And I would say, and Albert, do correct me if I am incorrect, the golden rule is consistency. You need to pick it and stick it. You need to, that comes with, I know we're not writing theses on Shakespeare, but, people I don't believe are going to care about, a dropped pronoun, or not a pronoun, but, an adverb here or there, but you need to really, like I said, pick it and stick it. You need to, this is sort of the default, present tense for known facts and hypotheses, past tense for experiments and conducted end results. This is probably a little bit of common sense, but what I hear about is my editors say, well, I kept reading through because even though I could tell they got caught up in their own research, and that sort of excited them, so it kept them working. But again, these editors, and I mean my editors, some of them get 500 submissions a month. So you need to get to the point. You need to make it as easy for them to help you and for them to want to read your paper. And so, and here's the consistency slide we show. It actually happens more often than you'd think. Paper's written, it's all done, and then you get to the figures, and the figures are sometimes in a foreign language, especially if they've been pulled from another paper and they're cited. There's nothing wrong with using another figure or a graph or a chart that's properly cited. It's just little attention to detail. If it gets by you, it may lead the impression that you don't care enough, which I'm sure is not true, but like I said, the amount of work that the editors get, I have 16 journals, and I think this year alone, total submission rate for last year was 24,000 papers. That's in 16 journals. So, you know, give them a break, if you will. Your science is probably very good. Your research is probably impeccable. You want to get your story across and get your story heard. So, having said all that, what are the elements of a proper paper? And again, this is a rhetorical question, has been touched upon. You've read papers. You know when you get lost, not just that big paragraph I threw at you there before. You know when you're reading a paper, you've read it all the way through. You know what you like, you know what you don't like. This might be another one where I could ask if the panel wants to jump in. Like I said before, you know, if you see something, you stop at the abstract, or you go through a submission, and if it has these, you know, 3 things, the caveat being whatever they say does not guarantee if you do exactly what they say that you'll get published.
I guess I'd make a comment about the 4 words that you had up there,
Shall I go back?
which were good words, but not quite the words. Mine's a bit more concise, I guess. So so I write 3 things. I write concise, precise, justified. So it's not quite the same, but concise we have listed there. What I see over and over again, including MIT graduate students and postdocs, is not being precise enough. So when you write a sentence, the sentence should say exactly what you intend it to mean. Exactly. Okay, it should be very, very like a laser, right? And it shouldn't be just sort of a lot of just blah, 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 but really should be very precise. Second thing I see a lot, luckily not as much from MIT grad students and postdocs, which is good, but I do see when I'm handling papers often, is where the logical flow of the paragraph and the sentences is not really there. So you see like non sequiturs, where someone will just sort of say a sentence, but it doesn't really follow from the previous sentences. And it's made like a statement as though it's fact, even though there's no justification. So that really leads to the third thing, which is justified. So if a statement is made, the statement should really, really be justified. And there's a whole bunch of words. The English language is a very, language has a lot of degrees of freedom in it. So you have A implies B, A suggests B. Something can be indicative. So there's a whole bunch of gradations in the English language. And so really the gradation should be completely justified as the statement. And so if something is suggesting something could be true, it shouldn't say this indicates that or this shows that, because those would be too strong. And so really when I think about writing for the technical audience, I really think about, even when I write essays, I think really about, it should be like a logically structured document that's completely should stand on its own and be justified. And if statements are made that aren't, then it starts to add a lot of, first the reader doesn't understand what you're trying to say, but the second is that there's a lot of, you start to feel like, well, maybe the experiments aren't careful, or maybe the theory wasn't, if they can't even write really in a very logical or consistent or justified way, then probably the research isn't even that way. So it sort of adds other sorts of questions in the mind. So, go ahead.
Yeah, so justification does come up in the papers that we get. Authors will sometimes do some amusing bit of theory that they think is cool and like, and they're all absorbed in the math of it, and they claim that it's of interest in computer science for such and such a reason. And regularly, referees will say, well, you know, this belongs in a math journal. We don't see that it has anything to do with us. The author's claims that it matters to computer science concerns, I don't believe, and they haven't justified them. So that would count as a kind of a justification issue. You know, I can't disagree with anything that anybody has said. They all make sense. You know, write clear, write concise, be targeted. But that's not advice that I would ever give to somebody in my field. What I mainly communicate to my students and colleagues is to plagiarize a famous guy. It should be as simple as possible, but no simpler. And pragmatically, what that means is that for my own papers and what I teach my students is, you know, a typical journal submission, we've completely rewritten 5 or 6 times. It gets drafted, it gets edited by colleagues, you get feedback on it, you realize there are simpler ways to do it, it keeps going. And we are converging on that, make it as simple as it can be, but no simple, which includes not leaving out key steps because you're too lazy to write them up. That's another reason why papers regularly get rejected or at least sent back for further revision, because the author makes some throwaway remark like, this is obvious. Obvious is, in my business, is an alarm word. As soon as that comes up in a paper, you stop and say, well, is it obvious to me or not? And if it's not, then the paper goes back to the author.
So these are like double great points because we've covered a few other things in future slides, so thank you for your efficiency. We've sort of touched upon this to some extent. Being mindful, the next series of slides are breaking down each one of these elements, and I think it would be wise to not gloss over them, but the panel's input thus far has sort of been building up to the details of the following elements of what goes in a good paper. So I'm just going to run through them quickly, if you will. You know, the title, that's your advertisement. That's what's going to get people to scroll down to the abstract. That's what is going to identify what you're talking about. We're just going to keep, I've added precise to my list of words here. So I think those 5 words, if I may, that really should be the embodiment of your title. Like I said, you're advertising your paper, and you're luring people in to read what you've written about, and contains, some of the common rules are in each element, no abbreviations. Be clear. I'm just going to keep repeating myself with some of these elements that if you're not understood, no one's going to read what you've written. And to thank you for saying something that I bring up often and I hear about is that little sloppy mistakes, like inconsistencies, stating something is obvious when it's not, or clearly evident, or declaring that you've cured cancer. It can leave the impression that, well, if it was kind of haphazard in the paper, what went on in the research building up to the paper? At the end of the day, you did cure cancer. Great, we'll buy you a drink. We'll say thank you. You can laugh, and it's all good. But it's these kind of declarative statements without any backing up, that it's not just indicative of concerns about the paper and how the paper is written, but it sort of seeps back into everything that went into how you ran your experiments, how you did the math, how you cleaned your beakers, whatever is going on. So jumping down into the abstract, this brings us back to the you're special. Your grandma thinks you're special, and that's great, but you need to really let us know why your paper is special. And also, one thing that's interesting is you're presenting this to, as I said before, a knowledgeable audience, in as much as that the editors-in-chief are the experts in the field, and the referees are probably, very, very well versed in the field. One of the biggest sort of curiosities that comes up is, don't avoid what's been done. Don't, if your paper is the complete opposite, if you're there to blow, MC squared out of the water, don't shy away from it. Don't avoid past works. And if you're going for a completely contradictory hypothesis of something that's been presented in the past, address it head on. And this comes up time and time again, is the sort of avoidance of what's already been done because you're doing the opposite or something along those that. And another rule, and again, it just boils down to the concise and the direct elements to sell yourself quickly. Whoops. I think every element from the introduction to the methods to the results, the key, at least from the publishing side, and what we talk to, no matter what campus we're on, what institute we're at, no matter where we are and who we're speaking to. So I'm going to parrot a lot of the same things that I've said thus far. And as maybe developed through the comments that are coming, disciplines have varying importance and attention to different details, but being able to be understood cross-discipline would be what I would suggest would be a good example of how you've written a good paper, is that could people from various ends of the engineering community understand what you're talking about. Albert, does that translate to computer science?
I'll pass on that one.
Okay, fair enough. The only point that I would highlight in this part is if you are doing, I'm going to just do one from my own expertise. If you are working on heat foil for Lockheed Martin and they have just dumped a pile of money into your lab so that you can do these experiments and figure it out, that is totally fine. But this has to be disclosed, transparent, that these are the materials used, they were, the reason these materials were used or this method was put forth or this simulation was what the focus was is because Lockheed Martin gave us a bunch of money and this is why was the funding behind the results. This is completely fine, just has to be transparent and upfront, and actually possibly, again, maybe even mentioned in your cover letter. And that's what I'm going to end up on. It's your last hurrah. Again, protocols, methods. This is your chance to describe how the problem was studied, and same rules, apply. No acronyms. The difference would be, before I said don't avoid what's been done, this is where you can talk about what you did, and you don't need to go into great depth as to everything that was done between 1960 and 1980, and then in 85 to 95 they did this, and then we came along in 2013 and we did this. You don't need that, but just a quick touch on. But this is a time for you to focus on what you've been working on and your methods. So that brings us quickly to the results section. Again, as you can see, every slide says, concise, well-organized, clear, direct. You're still telling a story, and depending on the structure of the journal, and this will be found in your guide for authors, is some present their works with the results and a discussion section, so 2 independent sections, and some have a results and discussion section. And that, like I said, is in your Mr. Webster Guide for Authors section. And it's where all your stats and your figures and your tables and your charts and your video and your WAV files and your everything goes. Now, I love this picture. This makes perfect sense to me. Everything above the waterline, that's what you send to your grandma who thinks and knows you're special. I'm not saying it's not important. And yes, there is infinite space on the internet, but that's not the place for your 10 lab books that were generated while you produced the work. The results, that's what goes in your paper. That's the story you're telling. And another thing is that going back to the making it easier for the, not making it easier, but lending yourself to, the editor and the reviewers going through is if they have reams and reams of supplemental material, they're not going to, that's not what they're going to read. They're going to read your paper. So focus on your paper and put the results in. And yes, all of your work is very, very important, but not necessary to put into the paper. So I really like this image of just, this you can't see, but this is what you've done, and it's very important. But up top is the story that you're telling. So it's a nice nutshell. And I think that translates across disciplines. The internet gave birth to an interesting, unexpected sort of phenomenon of, oh, there's all this space. Well, here's my paper, and here's 7 years of lab work. Oh, not the time or place. So this brings us to the discussion. And again, if it's a journal that has a results and discussion section versus the 2 sections, you're going to tweak this a little bit, but the elements are the same. And this was sort of touched on before about justification, or this is obvious, is this sometimes, some authors can almost derail themselves. They get excited, they talk about what this could mean, and they inadvertently almost present a new hypothesis. And this results, if it goes to reviewing, is usually when it comes back with review with major, and we need to see this experiment now because the author has inadvertently set themselves up to a whole new possibility. So you're selling what you've presented, and you're selling your work, and just be careful, from what I've heard about, not to give birth to a new idea. If you do give birth to a new idea, that's great. Write it down over here and write another paper. But I don't know if I should open that one up or if I just keep going. So now this one I am going to turn over because the conclusion, it's not the same as your summary. They need to support your results. This kind of touched on what I said about how you can inadvertently write a new hypothesis by getting excited by your own ideas, which is great. And this is also touching upon before I said, don't announce that you've cured cancer. It's great if you do, you can laugh at us later, but this is the #1 obstacle. Even some of the best papers get to this point, and not really sure why, and I can't identify a reason with why, but this seems to be the hardest part for even a very even a previously published author. They get derailed. So this would be one I would definitely throw back to the panel, just from what you've seen, or if you don't even want to talk about it because they're so horrendous. But at least in engineering, they definitely derail things.
I would agree that conclusions are often written very poorly. They're often written as a summary, like you said, which is not their purpose. And so they should really be focused on what are the specific conclusions from this paper. The last statement you mentioned about do not overreach, I agree with. It is fine in the conclusions, and in some disciplines even encouraged to have a sentence or maybe a paragraph on broader implications, but those broader implications cannot be overreaching. So And so they will use terminology, maybe even like the word implication, so that it's clear that they're not overreaching from the significance of the results.
I think I'll pass on this one.
All right.
It's not an issue that comes up much for the kind of papers that I deal with.
Excellent.
Actually, I would say that in most of the sciences, and so I'm more on hard sciences, I guess, in engineering, this doesn't actually decide usually the review comments too much. I think what it does is it limits the potential, the citations and impact of the paper is where it happens. I would say a similar thing with the title. So a reviewer may just say change the title, you change the title, but if often what a bad title does is that a lot of people end up not citing or become aware of the paper because the title's poor. And so you see the same thing, conclusions. Often someone will have a conclusion, they didn't put an inclusion because they wrote a summary, so it's buried in the paper somewhere, and then other people publish that as their conclusion, and they get all the credit for the work.
All right. References. Okay, four more golden rules. This actually is, I would say, this slide and this topic of references is probably why this full-blown presentation can take over 4 hours. So do all those things, cite other people's work and behave, and if you have any questions, ask your advisor or check with the Guide for Authors, or go to one of the, what do we have, 9 sites on Elsevier's ethics page. So there's a lot of author support. There's a lot out there. I'm not meaning to gloss over. I can just see this great big 630 up there. So you need to give Elena a chance to speak. I'm going to cringe because I know there's 3 more rules coming up. So, but I think when it comes to authorship, it's pretty clear cut. First author has done the work. The last author is, again, this is engineering, so I'll recant it's clear cut. In engineering, it's clear cut. The first author is the one doing the research and culling of the data and probably putting the paper together, and the last author is usually the lab's advisor or the student's advisor. You can't put your roommate in because they let you use his or her laptop when yours died. You know, buy him a beer, buy him a burger. That's not authorship. There is, if anyone is listed as an author, you absolutely have to make sure that they are aware that they're listed as an author, and definitely, in essence, get their permission. Sounds maybe like common sense, but you'd be surprised how many authorship situations land on my desk at the end of the day. So, and then if those 3 conditions are present, then that person deserves a listing in the authors of the paper. And the other contributors, like I said, I don't think anyone would care if you listed your roommate for lending the laptop, but it's not really necessary. This would also, one point that does sometimes, one question that comes up is, well, what about, the aforementioned Lockheed Martin, what about funders of your work? That kind of goes in acknowledgement sections. That doesn't go into authorships. So those are 3 things to avoid, and we have our lovely consistency rule. So it goes all the way. And the consistency rule for authorship, by what I mean here, is how you spell your name. And by that, I mean I could publish a paper, and it could be authored by Carrie Christensen. It could be authored by Carrie A. Christensen. It could be authored by C. A. Christensen. It could be authored by C. Christensen. Now, whatever one I pick doesn't matter to anybody but me and Scopus or Science Direct. The reason you need to be consistent is because, again, you're special, but you may share the name with someone else. And also, if you author 10 papers and spell your name, if you will, do Carrie Christensen or C.A. Christensen 3 different times, then 3 different C whatever Christensens are going to have the citations. So it's part of future tracking for your citations in the future. So it's very important to be consistent about that. Another stick and pick.
I want to ask a question about the previous point, though, about gift authorships.
Oh, sure.
So I was amazed about to hear that some Society of Medical Journal authors have decided that of editors have decided that authors should actually contribute. What comes to mind is what may be dated now is we have long used a scenario in our own kind of ethical professional seminar for graduate students where we discuss how you deal with a conflict between cultures when you're a co-author and you're an engineer working with a bunch of biologists, and the biologists tell you that their convention is that the director of the lab gets their name added as the last author, and even if they've never seen the paper, I mean, they get to see the paper and approve it, but even though they participated in no way other than providing support in an environment, a laboratory environment, that's the convention, which is certainly not the case in computer science. So here's this computer science student who suddenly finds that, or postdoc finds that this person they've never heard of, who they know has participated in no way to the contents of the paper, is a co-author. What should they do? And we have long discussions about how do you resolve this cultural clash. Now, I guess my question is our ethical dilemma dated, or is it really a consensus among medical journals and biology journals that there are no gift authorships of this kind?
Cross-discipline. No.
Go ahead. Well, it's very different in different fields. For example, if you're doing something like nuclear physics, in nuclear physics, you often see papers with over 100 authors, and it's very common for well over half of the people who've never seen the paper and not contributed in any way. But there'll be an agreement that's done a priori when you have like 20 countries come together to put a huge amount of money in some big piece of equipment, that they're going to have, all the authors are going to be, alphabetical, first by country, then by last name of the authors. They're all going to be listed on every paper, and I've known cases where people that have been high up in these kind of situations where they have authors no one's ever met, no one's ever seen, and they're in some country that starts with an A, and so they're actually listed as first author, even though they have no knowledge if the person really exists or not. So there are very, very different cultures and very, very different fields. I think even within biology, I know of cases of biology I won't go into details, but I think even in biology there's quite a bit of variability about how these things are handled.
Yeah, I would say, I guess there must be. I mean, I think we encourage authorship to be thought about seriously. We encourage people to actually list the contributions of each author so other people will know, the readers will know. Certainly, as Carrie said, every person who is an author, we expect, knows that they're an author on the paper, has seen the paper, and was able to contribute to the writing of the paper. And I think we talk about, is providing a reagent a reason to be an author on a paper? I think that's less common now than it used to be in biology and less well accepted. So I think things are probably evolving and changing, but it's something as you as an author on the paper should be aware of when you're putting the paper together, and it's okay to ask questions about it and find out what people contributed.
All right. So now you think you're done. You're not. This lends itself to the sort of the slapdash or the sloppy mistakes that I mentioned before. There's no denying that a tremendous amount of effort, years of your life have been, potentially invested here. So at this point, there's no need to rush. What's more important is that you make sure that you have put your best foot forward in everything we've talked about to the best of your ability. And this is when, you know, you walk around talking to yourself as you read your paper out loud so that you read the words that are actually there, not what you thought you wrote 6 months ago. And it's okay, because everyone's going to assume that you're on your cell phone, not that you're nuts. So have your roommate read it, have a trusted colleague read it, have an advisor read it out loud, videotape yourself reading it. Just make sure what you thought you wrote is what you've actually written.
I just can't resist interjecting that this is the first time that I completely agree.
Yes. Okay. You're up. I'm gonna quit while I'm ahead. No, and it's also and all this feeds into the cover letter, and the cover letter is this is really your elevator pitch. You postdoc, you are. Well, I'm going to use it because some of you know him and he's not here, so you get to talk to Jürgen Bata. You probably can do that anyway because his office is right across, down the street or somewhere. But you get to talk to the internationally renowned editor-in-chief of Computer Methods and Applied Engineering. This is when you get to talk to the editor-in-chief. And again, this is your why I'm special, or more importantly, why my paper is special, and why you, sir or ma'am, should take your time and read my paper before, you know, during your reading or reviewing of these hundreds of other papers. And this would be another sort of puzzlement my editors come with me of, this is like a form letter. Like, again, you know, like why would they just, you know, toss this off? I can almost see, you know, dear editor-in-chief, insert name here. So it's not easy, but again, this is your time to shine. This is your time to get their attention, and this is your time to lay it all out there. This is your chance for a one-on-one with the big dogs in your field. So don't blow it. They might not remember what you wrote. I doubt any of you would be impolite or unprofessional, but if it comes across as haphazard, they just assume that, you know, you may be just going through the motions, and you're going to submit to another journal when you find out from them, and then move on down the trenches. And it's a very important part of the process, and it's curiously, I'm not sure, and I'll throw this back to the panel. You can almost say it with me, back to the panel. I'm not sure if this is part of the phenom of electronic publishing. Is now, it's, you know, you click a button, and submit. You know, it used to be 4 copies, go to the post office, lick stamps, sign pieces of paper. Maybe in our attempts to help you be efficient and to help streamline the process of publishing with technology, we made it a little too formulaic and click a button and insert a cover letter. But don't be mistaken. This is very crucial, and it's, like I said, it's your time to talk to the editor-in-chief of the journal. So don't disregard it.
I would say it depends. So for some things, it's absolutely critical for some publications, because there are some publications that will editorial reject over half the papers that are submitted. And so for those, you really, really need to make sure you do the cover letter very, very well. There are other ones that I mean, like, for example, my magazine, cover letter is irrelevant. I will look at it briefly, but I'll ignore it because I'll just look at the paper. I don't handle a huge number of papers for the publications that I handle, so I can just go through it myself. So really, it really depends quite a bit. Now, there's a second thing that's very closely related to this, and that is that it's related actually to the title and the introduction, in the sense that if you do have a publication, for example, as Common Biology, that just rejects with editorial reject without review, you also need to make sure that the title and the introduction and abstract are also written in a way, because even if the cover letter is good, if they look at the rest of it and if it also doesn't look like it's the right scope for the journal, they'll boot it out. So let me give you an example. So I had a postdoc who submitted a paper to a biojournal, very theoretical paper, but it was for a biological problem. And I had seen, previous drafts of the paper, it looked very good. So I'm like, oh yeah. And she said, oh, can I submit to this particular journal? I said, oh yeah, sure, why not? And it was a theoretical biology journal. So it was submitted, and then it was rejected right away. I'm like, that's impossible. I mean, this is a very good paper. So I looked at the paper, and the title was good, and the cover letter was good. And the abstract was good, pretty good. But the introduction was written of a form, this is all this great theory, and it applies to this biology problem. Instead of, this is the biology problem, and this is the mathematics used to solve the biology problem. So the introduction was sort of flipped around. Theory first, and then biology, instead of biology, then theory. And that was why it was booted right away. And they should have booted it right away. So it wasn't written within the scope of the publication.
So the cover letters that I see are basically, we like to submit the attached paper to your journal. And that's typical, and I don't really expect any more. It's the paper, the abstract, the introduction, the list of references. Those are the things that I look at to get a very quick idea of, is this a real paper or not? I mean, again, to calibrate you, I'm just trying to guess. I would guess that we're only getting like 25 submissions a month. Of those, 10 go to referees. And 15 of them, 10 of the 15 I will summarily reject because they're clearly out of scope, or they're clearly incompetent. They're claiming some result in a field where they're missing all the major references, and I don't want to even bother my editors with that. My main job as editor-in-chief is to figure out if this is a real paper that merits attention by somebody who genuinely is informed in the field more deeply than I am, which of my 40 or so editors on my editorial board is the one that I should send it to and ask them to handle it. And again, if I have doubts about it, but I'm not sure, I'm not ready to summarily reject it, I will send a cover letter to my editor saying, remember, it's your prerogative to reject without review. Our reviewer's time is precious. These are very hard papers to review. If you really think this is a weak paper, you do not have to justify your decision to reject by having it reviewed. Getting it published, I would insist on justification in almost all cases by having a proper review. But rejection is cheap. I don't think it does a lot of damage because an author can always, if they get a quick rejection, they just submit somewhere else, and that's their prerogative. So we're not doing terrible damage to people. When in doubt, you should reject. Again, the cover letter is something I have no experience with. They're just not relevant. The one time that you get cover letters, that I get cover letters, is please send my paper to this editor, which often is not I'll do because it's the editor's job to find the referees, and I don't mind sending it to some particular editor or not. I also get requests, please send it, or may I suggest that you consider these people to referee because they're particularly competent. And mostly I ignore those when they're offered as try these because they're competent. I also get, and we've talked about this before, very occasionally an author will say, please don't send it to these referees because we have a thing going or something. And Richard told me that according to cope, I guess, that this is considered to be unethical for an editor to send it to a referee whom the author explicitly asks them not to do. I do that fairly regularly. Again, on the grounds that we're not going to let this questionable referee have a defining say in what we do with the paper, but often as not, I want to hear what that person has to say to see whether it's credible or it sounds like they have it in on a personal basis for this author. I want to understand what it is that makes this author say that this referee's voice shouldn't be heard. I want to hear the voice and reject it myself. So that's kind of where I come from. But those are very unusual, and mostly they're not material.
Yeah, I think for us at Cell Press in biology and life sciences, the cover letter is very important. I think it is, as Carrie said, your chance to make your case for the significance of the findings directly to the editor. I think what I find sometimes is it's somehow easier for authors to make their case in a cover letter in a few paragraphs than it is in the whole paper. And there are times where I get I get to the end of the introduction, I still don't know what the point is yet or why they've submitted to sell. I get further through the paper, I still don't go. And then I go back to the cover letter, and it's often very clearly described there what the finding, the significance of the finding is. And I think then I can help the authors. If I agree that it's significant, I can help the authors get there with the writing of their paper. But I think it's an interesting kind of thing. And I think it is something to pay attention to for us.
Well, let me just ask, because this is a reflection of my misunderstanding. I don't understand the difference between what you put in a cover letter to an editor-in-chief or an editor that doesn't belong in your paper. I mean, certainly an explanation of the significance of your work belongs right up front in the introduction. So what's the difference?
It's true. It's just sometimes it doesn't match, so it's helpful to then read the cover letter. So I think also in the cover letter we do ask for suggestions and exclusions of reviewers. We always respect exclusions. There's a lot of reasons why you might exclude somebody, and we recommend that if in doubt, rule them out. Your suggestions are often helpful because it gives me a sense of what kinds of expertise you think is necessary to assess the paper. And you might suggest someone who I hadn't thought of. We don't always use suggestions, but we often do, and it can be helpful.
So an excellent example of how the cross-disciplines are going to have very, very varied impact. And I think, yes, this would be another place where I was mentioning, it says conflict of interest, but transparencies in terms of funding and maybe why you use certain materials or certain methodologies, based on Boeing or Lockheed Martin specifics because they're the ones that are funded the research. So that's another use for the cover letter, at least in the, definitely in the aerospace, but in my end of engineering. So I think, yes. So I only went 25 minutes over.
I think because we went a little over, it would probably be best if we went right into the next presentation.
Yeah.
And save the actual audience questions at the end to make sure that we get all the content.
Yes.
Okay.
So thank you for your time, and I'm going to pass things over to. I'm going to pull up your.
Oh, great. Thank you.
Yeah. See, and if you stick around for the free food, then you can grill me on the specific elements of the results section of your paper. So get out of your way. Okay. Take it away.
Carrie.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm just going to take you through my view of what happens to a paper once you submit it. It often seems like a mystery to people, seems like a black box, and I think the more you know about it, the more it's going to help you navigate the process. So as I mentioned, I'm Elena Porro. I'm the Senior Deputy Editor at Cell. I'm going to give you a perspective from the life sciences and from biology, and as we've heard, there are a lot of differences. So I'm going to try to keep that in mind as we go through and make sure that we're taking into account the differences between the disciplines. A little bit about Cell. Cell is published by Cell Press, which is a family of 16 primary and 14 review journals. We are located, our main office is just down the street on Main Street in Kendall Square. Just to give you a view, Cell of one of those journals is published every 2 weeks. And we have a mixture of primary research manuscripts and review and opinion pieces. Most of our review and opinion pieces are we invite, as Carrie mentioned, we do take inquiries for those too. Sometimes we take things that people just send in. I'm not going to talk so much about the review and opinion pieces in my presentation, but if you have questions about them, I'd be happy to answer them. At Cell, we have a staff of 12 professional full-time PhD editors. This is one of the differences in some of the journals that we're talking about. Some of the journals, as these guys' journals, are run by academics who have a team of an editor-in-chief and a team of editors that they distribute their papers to. We have an in-house staff of editors full-time. Cell Press is part of Elsevier, as you might have realized by now. Our office also has some publishers and editors from other parts of Elsevier, particularly life sciences, down the street. And we have a few publication guide videos at cell.com that go over a lot of these parts of the process. If you're interested in that, check them out online. So what do we see as the role of editors? I mean, I think as editors, we are trying to decide what papers to publish in our journal every 2 weeks. Papers come in, they're submitted that we don't know anything about until they get there, but we also go out and recruit papers. We get to know scientists and what they're working on. We go to conferences, we visit people at their institutions, and we encourage people to submit papers as well. We are overseeing the peer review process, which we look at as facilitating effective dialogue between authors, reviewers, and we're trying to ensure that the process is fast, efficient, and productive. We're also setting editorial policy for the journals. Cell is a general interest journal across biology, so we publish in a lot of different subdisciplines, and we want to ensure that we're making consistent decisions across the different subdisciplines. And as editors, we try to keep abreast of what's going on in all these areas of biology, as I say, by going to conferences and staying in touch with the community. And we're guiding strategic development of the journal and of the press. So what happens when a manuscript is submitted? The paper is read by one of the Cell editors. This editor will also take a look at the literature to see how this finding fits in and to assess whether the present work represents a significant conceptual advance. This editor will handle the paper throughout the review process. Papers are also discussed among the editorial team at our daily editorial meetings, and decisions are meant to be reflective of the team's opinion of the paper. So what are we looking for when we read a new manuscript? First, does it ask an interesting and important question? Does it provide a significant conceptual advance before what was known before? Does it change the way we think about a biological problem, a process, or a particular issue in some way? We're at this point in our initial evaluation, editorial evaluation, we're not really doing a deep technical assessment. What we're really looking at is, are the experiments logically designed, and are the right experiments to answer that question? So not really, does it have all the controls, et cetera, which is going to be worked out in the more thorough peer review, but really, are these the right experiments to answer this question? Can you make these conclusions based on these types of experiments? And we also are looking at whether the paper is well presented for a broad audience. We've talked a little bit about targeting your writing to the right journal, and I think for Cell, the challenge is it really covers a lot of areas, and you want a reader in one subdiscipline to be able to understand the significance of your paper in a different subdiscipline. All right, so we've already talked about a lot of these, so I won't dwell on this, but I think choosing the right journal is very important. I think the things that we mentioned that I think are important are really looking at your audience. Who do you want to get this message across to? And that can help you choose the journal. So do you want it for a general interest journal that covers a lot of areas? Do you want it to have a focused audience in a particular area? The cover letter we just talked about. I think the whole point of what Carrie went through is really to present your data and your story as clearly as possible. Stay within the length and supplemental information guidelines. Longer is not better, in my view. I think forcing yourself to be concise, you're going to get your message across in a much clearer way. So I sort of tell this as you want to present a story. You want to present your work as a story. I think there's a human being on the other side reading this paper, and humans tend to take things in as a narrative and stories. So I think I look at this as that means you're not going to present every point with equal emphasis and equal level of detail. I think what you're looking for is to build up to the most important piece of data, and you don't want people to get stuck in the details before they get there and just stop reading. I like to look at it as thinking of it as a story. I think what's very helpful is at many points in the process when you're writing is to ask a colleague who's not familiar with the work to read the paper and give you some input. And I think the person you're looking for is someone that you know is going to give you honest feedback and is willing to really take some time and point out the places. I think it's really, for someone who's not familiar with the work, it's really easy to point out the places that aren't making sense or that they're not quite getting your storyline. So I think that can be very helpful. So the outcome of the initial editorial evaluation, we either return the manuscript to the authors with an explanation of why we think the paper isn't a strong candidate for the journal. And this is where we try to write a letter that shows we've read and understand the paper, and these are the reasons why we think it's not a strong candidate. Or we send the paper out for review, and we identify suitable reviewers for the paper. Now, we could talk for an hour in itself on how we choose reviewers. I think it's a real art, and I'm not going to go into it here, but if you have questions about that, and I often get a lot of questions about that, I'd be happy to answer those. So we're asking reviewers to provide comments both on the technical competence, so the technical soundness of the paper, how well the results support the conclusions, and also whether they think the paper is a good fit for the cell in terms of its contribution in terms of conceptual advance, or whether it might be more suited to another journal. We asked reviewers to return their reports with 10 days, so life science tends to be a fast-moving review process, and our aim is to get back to authors in 4 weeks or less, from the day of submission to reviews and decision in hand. Reviewers can make confidential comments to the editor, so we have a section in the review report where they can make comments to the editor and comments to the author. We have a whole reviewer guideline document on the web if you're interested in what advice we give to reviewers to write their report. And we do recommend that the message in the comments to the editors is similar to the message that they give to the authors directly. Okay. And so what we're looking for is, from the reviewers, is a summary of what they think the advance and significance of the paper is, the take-home message, whether this presents an exciting advance that would be of broad interest to the audience of Cell. We're looking for their view of the key technical concerns, basically the 1 or 2 major things that really need to be improved, and then any minor technical issues, and a recommendation of whether further experiments, usually in a 2-month time frame, is going to make this paper appropriate for Cell, or whether or not the scope of the advance is more appropriate for a more focused journal. When the reviewers come back, what do we as editors do with them? Reviewers don't always agree. Maybe you know this. How many of you have actually submitted your own papers and experienced this review process for yourself? Okay, great. Reviewers don't agree. So our decision is not a simple counts of for and against, and the majority wins. We're looking for the editors trying to understand the reviewers' opinions on the paper and why they are recommending publication or not. And we're combining this with our own view of the paper to decide whether it would be productive and whether it's a paper we want to publish and whether it be productive to invite a revision of the paper. If the reviewers' comments are unclear, if we're not quite sure what they mean when we get the written comments, we'll try to call them up and have a short conversation with them, which often clarifies a lot of their viewpoint. And we can also ask them, say the reviewers disagree in a fundamental way. One of them says this thing has a technical flaw, sort of a fatal flaw, and the other reviewers don't mention it. We might write to the reviewer who didn't mention it and say, the other reviewer mentioned this issue, you didn't mention it. Do you think it's a valid and important concern? And they might think, oh yeah, it's a valid concern, it's not important for this reason. They might think, oh yes, actually that is important and I missed it. That's the thing that would need to be addressed. So in having a conversation with the reviewers, we can clarify their view, which brings us to a decision a little faster. And then our goal is to communicate this decision to the authors. and the grounds. If we're rejecting the paper, we're going to explain why again. And if we're inviting a revision, we're going to try to work with the authors to focus on the most important revisions so that they don't need to do every single thing that a reviewer may request, but we're really going to try to focus on what we think are the major things that need to be improved. So, what do you do when you receive this decision letter and the reviewer's comments? First, I just want to back up a little bit and talk about what this whole process is for. The whole review process is designed to help you improve your paper. It's meant as a positive, constructive thing so that you can help improve your paper. I think it means that you're going to get some criticism, so I think you need to be prepared for that. I think you've worked sometimes years up to this point. You've spent a lot of time preparing the paper, and I think you are so relieved to get it off your desk and submitted that then you need to take some time preparing yourself for what's going to come back at you. And I think it is going to involve criticism. It's going to involve suggestions for improving the paper, and I think you just sort of need to be prepared for that and be able to look at it in a constructive way. So what you want to do, you're going to get reviews that are written in all different kinds of tones. I think what you want to try to do is look through the tone for the constructive criticism in there, and it's in there. There's valid criticisms in there. And look for the scientific issues that are going to help you improve the paper. Say a reviewer suggests an experiment that you think is baloney, it's not going to work, it's not going to give you interpretable results. Well, then look for the underlying issue that reviewer is trying to address with that experiment, and you're probably going to be able to think of a better experiment that's going to be able to address that underlying issue. So if the reviews or the editorial evaluation are suggesting that the paper is of not sufficient general interest, or the conceptual advance is limited for this journal, I think then you should really think about submitting the manuscript to another journal. Another thing that might happen is you get the reviews and the editor's decision, and you don't agree. You think the reviewers were way off base. You think the editor missed the point. I think then it's reasonable for you to write to the editor and explain why you think that the main point has been missed, and ask for a possibility of reconsideration. We consider rebuttals, and we often reconsider papers. If we've made a mistake, if we've missed something, we want to know about it, and we want you to tell us about it. We encourage this dialogue between authors and editors. Editors are people too. It does seem like this kind of black box where you're throwing your paper, and I think that it's important to remember there's a person on the other side of that, a person that you can email with and speak to. If you've been invited to revise a paper, then you want to think about how you're going to present the revision, and it's often helpful to provide a detailed point-by-point response to the reviewer's comments so that if the paper is sent back to that reviewer, they'll be able to easily look through and see how you've modified and improved the paper. I think, you're not necessarily going to be experimentally addressing every point that the reviewer raises, and in those cases, you want to explain why you didn't do that. If you end up with a response where you're explaining why you didn't do for every point, it might not be productive for you to return that paper for revision. That's something to think about. So we've talked about ethics a little bit throughout. I think I can just summarize these things, many of which you probably already know. You're going to submit to one journal only at a time. If you have a related paper under consideration in another journal, it's good to let the editor know that. I think a lot of the issues come up have to do with figure preparation and how you present your data. So know how to prepare a figure, learn how to do that. Show your advisor the primary data, so your advisor can help you move from the primary data to the figure presentation, and avoid over-manipulation of data. So many journals have data processing policies, and it's great for you to become familiar with those before you're preparing the figures. And this is something that probably differs a lot over different kinds of data and different disciplines, but it's something that you should familiarize yourself with. As we mentioned, declare conflicts of interest, include co-authors in the manuscript writing process so that all the co-authors know that the paper exists and that they have a chance to comment on it before it's submitted. There's a lot to have to do with reviewer ethics. How many of you are actually help your advisor in reviewing papers and are learning about that? That's great. I think it's a really great way to learn about the review process. So if you haven't had the opportunity yet, it's something that you might ask your advisor that you'd like to get involved with. Reviewer ethics have things to do with, like, when you get a paper to review, you're keeping that paper confidential, so you're not sharing it at a lab meeting, for instance. It's okay for the advisor to ask one or a couple of members of the lab to help him review or her review the paper, but I think those people also will keep the paper confidential. It's sort of accepted that you won't use anything that you learn in a paper that you're reviewing to advance your own research. It's important to exclude yourself from the review process and decline an invitation if you are working on something very similar, or if you have a project that's very similar, then you don't want to review that paper, so it's best to decline and just tell the editor, I have a conflict of interest. I think we've just touched on plagiarism and self-plagiarism. I think it's something that you want to be very familiar with, so educate yourself about that. I think if you discover an error in your paper, and this can be at any point in the process, say it's after you submitted it while it's under review, contact the editor and correct it right away. Even if after it's published you discover an error, or somebody else points out an error to you in your published paper, figure out what happened very quickly and contact the editor that you've discovered this error and you'd like to correct it. I think a lot of publications have a policy that if you're reporting your work in that journal, then you're expected to provide reagents and raw data that the paper's based on to anyone who requests it. So we sometimes get inquiries from people that say, oh, I wrote to this author and 3 times over 3 months and they haven't provided me with this reagent. So I think these are the kind of things that are just good scientific practice, and you're building your reputation in the community, and these are things you really want to pay attention to. I think good scientific practice is critical for all your kinds of activities in lab, keeping a lab notebook, your lab note meetings, going to conferences, and you want to educate yourself about what is good practice and ethical behavior. So proper methodologies, the limitations to a particular methodology, proper experimental design and application, what statistics are appropriate to use to analyze your data. Another interesting thing has come up more and more, I think, as people are doing interdisciplinary work, is that you find yourself collaborating with someone that you might not know very well. And I think you're going to be attached to this person professionally from now on. So it's a really good idea to get to know and trust your collaborators, where you're sharing the credit for this work, but you're also sharing the responsibility, so that if there's a problem down the line, it's much better to get on top of those issues right at the beginning before you submit the paper. I have more about misconduct. Let's see. The thing about industry, because I think Carrie covered this. Did you talk about this? Fabrication, falsification, or plagiarism? Big deal, research misconduct. It doesn't include honest error, differences of opinion, or necessarily the inability to replicate. I think what's interesting to me is sort of these questionable research practices that may qualify as forms of misconduct. Failure to achieve ethics approval for animals or human subjects. Redundant publication, as we've talked about, so submitting your paper to more than one journal. Selective use of statistics, questionable statistics, ignoring outliers in a data set, authorship issues that we've discussed, removing, hiding, missing data, prettifying data, poor data management and recording, and not disclosing conflict of interest. I mean, I think these are all things that you should be aware of and that you should be avoiding, and I think it's a really good idea to just talk about them openly and sort of get an idea of what the expectations are for you, so that you can build a strong reputation right from the start.
I just wanted to add one thing to the list. There's you said redundant publication, and let's distinguish that from double publication. Double publication meaning you're sending the same paper to 2 different places. It's clearly out of line, and when we catch you, we apply sanctions. Like, you know, you can't submit a paper to us for another 2 or 5 years or something like that. But I get regularly, like twice a year, I get the feedback that this paper that the author has submitted is 70% the same as another paper that they previously published. And that's self-plagiarism, and it's typically violation of copyright, because you've given the copyright to another publisher, and you're supposed to get their permission to reuse it. Sometimes publishers, I think Elsevier, will allow you to reuse your own stuff on your web page and so on. But that's out of line, and when the reviewers report that, we go back to the author and say, well, you need to make your paper concise and cut it down to what's new, and only include the absolutely essential stuff that a fresh reader will need in order to appreciate your current results. Don't simply throw in indiscriminately most of the stuff that appeared in the introduction and preliminary sections of your other papers.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. This is sometimes referred to as salami slicing. Yeah, and I think even if you retain the copyright, which is, you know, if in a lot of open access journals you will, I think to build your reputation, you want to think hard about how to deal with that, and sort of how to distinguish your work one from another. Okay, so that was kind of a downer to end on.
Let me end on an upper, because I want to say that I am impressed with how much more exciting Cell is than my operation. It really sounds cool.
Oh, thank you. So I hope that gives you an idea of what happens when your paper is submitted. Again, it's going to be different for different journals. I think you can depend on the fact that the editor is absolutely putting a lot of effort and is responsibly deciding whether your paper is appropriate for their journal or not. And if you disagree with them, I think that's you can raise that with them. But I think editors are people too is a good thing to remember. Okay, so we had a bunch of questions that came in advance from you guys. I guess we can open this up completely to questions, right, Ryan? If you have a question.
Yes, please. So let's just open it up and for about 15 minutes or so, and then we'll move on to kind of start the discussion, and we can continue as we go out. If you have questions, please just come up to the mic and address them.
Hey, thank you. It's a really cool presentation. I guess I'd never really thought about submitting one paper to multiple journals before.
Yeah.
And I'm actually surprised to hear it phrased as an ethical issue, because it seems to me almost an economic one, because journals review lots of different authors' papers simultaneously and reject most of them.
Yeah.
So I don't understand why it shouldn't work the same way where an author can do the same thing with different journals.
Yeah, it's a setup that's not necessarily mostly beneficial to the author. It might be more beneficial to the author to shop around and put their paper at many journals and take the best offer. I mean, I think this is the way the system is set up currently. So that's sort of the rule as we see it now. It doesn't mean that it might not change or things might change. I think one thing that is possible is pre-submission inquiries where you can shop your paper around to different journals. And I think that's a good opportunity to find out. Usually you send an abstract or some short description of the significance of the finding, maybe some figure legends. You write to the editor and get a sense of how excited they are about the paper before you format the paper to that journal's requirements, before you spend a lot of time putting the final details on a paper. And that will give you a sense of how excited an editor is, and it might help you choose between a few different journals if you're having trouble deciding.
Actually, I think the reason that you aren't allowed to send the same manuscript to multiple journals at the same time is that it opens up makes it extremely easy to do unethical things that are unethical by other means. So let me give you an example. So someone did this, and then I was a reviewer, but eventually I was informed what happened. So they submitted the same manuscript to 2 journals, and then one got accepted. So then during the revision, they replaced it with a different paper. You follow?
No.
So, okay, so what they did is, so this is how they did it. So 2 papers were submitted in parallel, okay, so 2 different journals. They can't publish both of them because people will eventually figure out what happened.
Yeah.
So one of them got accepted first. So they went, okay, they left that one. The other one that was identical, what they did is during the revision, they rewrote the paper. It's actually a different paper, but the same topical area.
Wasn't the revision reviewed?
Well, the thing was that there was no communication to tell the people about the other paper. So what it was a way to actually, in the process, switch a paper with another paper.
Wow.
So,
Okay.
And
So let me comment on the ethics of it, because in fact, it's an offensive ethical thing to do. And basically, in my community, the referee's time is precious, and refereeing a serious paper in theoretical computer science is tremendously demanding. It can take, 40, 50 hours to really go through the details of a paper, understand it, make sure it's well explained and clear, and we cannot afford to have you submit to 2 journals, which guarantees that half the referee's efforts is going to be wasted. The community just doesn't have the resources to tolerate that, and it is in fact infuriating. If I catch you, I'm going to come down real hard.
Yes, I was going to add that is the number one pain point is it's just rude. You're wasting people's time, and if you've had your own time wasted, you can appreciate that. And from a logistical point, as a publisher in charge of 14 different computational engineering journals, it's not entirely fair that you submit your paper and the review process may take between, we've heard, 2 weeks. My reality is more 45 to 60 days. And rejection is hard. A long-waited rejection is harder. But what happens also is, let's just say that one of the journals you've submitted to is an Elsevier journal, and another journal is run by Wiley or IEEE. Now, eventually we will find out that, let's say the timing is so perfect that they both go into the first stage of rejection the same week. And now with electronic technology on our side, we have articles in press, and the paper gets a date of issuance in 2 different journals within the same week. Then the publishers have to go head-to-head to find out who got it first, who actually published it first, and therefore backtracking to see who actually got the copyright first. So again, there are many reasons and for both why you might think it's a good idea and why we can tell you that it's really not a good idea. And to echo Albert, the most concise way to say it is it's just rude because you're wasting people's time. So, but there are a lot of elements that build into why it's gonna backfire. But I think there's also recognition that the faster we can turn papers around properly for the authors. Rejects are hard to get, but a reject after 2 years is equally infuriating. So.
Thank you.
So there are a number of mechanisms for improving the quality of journal papers. One of them is to submit to conferences before and then publish in the proceedings, and then that turns into a journal paper. I suppose that's okay. But some journals actually don't let you distribute preprints. And that's a real inconsistency. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, I think this is probably one of those field-specific things too. I think there are fields where preprint culture is historically valuable and acceptable and totally fine to publish a preprint or post a preprint and then publish in a journal afterwards. In some fields, it's not well accepted. I think at CEL, we don't consider papers that have already been, where the preprint has been posted on archive. That said, we don't look at the archives, so if you don't tell us, we won't know about it.
So your question, I think, slightly confuses me because you raised two issues. One is pre-publication in a conference, and the other was preprints. I see those as really completely different. At least in my field, it's virtually universal that any worthwhile paper has been vetted by conference presentation first. Our journal is really serving an archival purpose. The paper has been out, it's already influenced the active research community. Now the details get fleshed out, the proofs get written out in full, it gets carefully checked, it gets edited, a polished version gets printed in our journal, and it's designed to stand for the next decades. Preprints are not an issue, I mean, or if anything, they're the publisher's issue, not my issue as a journal editor. I would, in fact, Elsevier is pretty good about posting articles on the web even before they appear in the journal, as soon as they are adequately typeset and ready to be read by the outside world.
Yeah, if you were to sneak a peek at some of my journals in Science Direct, I just had an alert that I have, it's December 2013, it's already available online, so it's definitely, that's reflected in engineering is, if you do something in conference proceedings beforehand, that's fine, then, you know, come to us with your complete journal article.
Yeah, so in terms of discipline specific, there are certain parts, for example, in theoretical biology, where if you publish the conference paper, you're actually not allowed to publish the journal paper, even though the journal paper is expanded. So in the control field, you almost always, if it's a good paper, it's been submitted to a conference. It used to be that the conference paper could be submitted exactly the same for the journal paper, with the reasoning that the journal paper would be substantially revised through the review process. But they've changed the rules now for most of the control engineering so that the journal paper now has to be 50% different approximately from the proceedings papers. That rule came in about 2 years ago. So, you know, so things are different in different fields about the proceedings versus journal paper.